I explore the many waves of blockades between myself and being in love and in a closer to divine state, bringing who I am into the world in loving relationship. There's a series of blockades, and as I look at those blockades, the first blockade is a blockade of dissociation, trauma, around not being able to connect deeply with parents and thus relax. Not being able to come into my body and feel protected from shock, which resulted in extreme contraction and withdrawal and extreme fear. This perpetuated and moved into the pleaser persona, with trying to please and get attention in a variety of ways, and feeling angry and hurt that that didn't work. And a lot of sadness and grief. And the most lonely aspect of that was getting the message that what pleased both of my parents was for me to disappear, to not exist. So the pleaser, which was a persona to try and succor love, became turned in on itself, because rather than being reciprocal in a loving relationship, the message was, it would please me if you didn't exist, which is, then there's a response to that, to try not to exist, which takes the wound much deeper. There's then a bitterness and a darkness in being banished into a non-existent place that starts to emerge. And then this is recognized as who I am, and is given respect and attention when I start bullying, when I start demanding attention, when I start pushing. Then I exist and am recognized as existing. But now there's a new wound, because now the first identity that is securing adequate support is an identity of the pusher in around 7, 8 years old. Poking, pushing, boundaries, and this coincide with a strategy of the dishonesty and the volatility within my parents' relationship. And we were in a state of relative social isolation in upstate New York, without media. Becomes lonely in the unknown, not having a boundary to know. Becomes a new form of loneliness that they say this, but it's not the case. So there's nothing to know. And so this also then moved into the boundary pusher, to know something and to feel the satisfaction of knowing. But the loneliness and the betrayal of having to push that hard in order to know. And this is a new level of grief, that the only knowing that I come to trust and experience is a knowing through violation. It's hearing the words, this is the way it is, realizing that's not the case at all. So it's pushing through the lie to find out what really is, to find where is the boundary present and consistent. And that's what I want to know. I want to know what's real. But in doing so, there's a precedent that the only way to really know someone is through pushing through their lies and delusions, which puts me into a stage of violation, or a state of violating. Not violating the truth, but violating the delusion and the unspoken that is put forth as the truth, which is a state of profound grief, because I don't want to violate. I don't want to be in a state of violating. I don't want to need to do that to know someone. So there's deep grief around that I am all alone in feeling. The next deep grief comes that the part of me that is engaging with the world is now engaging in the face of the shadow. That the direct desire to please, the direct desire to engage and to see, were all deflected. And so the way that I'm engaging is through violation, through intimidation, through, in a certain sense, violence. And this is the language through which I am receiving boundary regulation and core needs. Because a child will go insane. I would go insane if I grew up attuned to the delusions of two delusional parents. I need to be attuned to something solid, something that's consistent rather than erratic. In training monkeys, where if they get an electric shock, they then get food, they will choose the electric shock, understanding the consistency that I have to get shocked in this particular design in order to be fed. And that is a sociopathic design, of course, led by sociopathic scientists in a sociopathic culture that can't learn this in any other way, but it still illustrates the point that an animal will choose consistent pain that then leads to pleasure if it's set up that way. But the same animal, when the pain is erratic, they won't choose the pain, and they won't get fed, and they will curl up, and they will die. Any consciousness entering into an ecosphere, in this case the ecosphere of the five senses and the reality that the five senses can perceive, along with thought, imagination, emotion as additional senses, needs to attune and regulate to the consistent constants within that environment to create safety, to create beauty, to create rapport. And when the only way to do that is to push through the delusions and the lies of one's protectors and guardians, a child will do that. But in doing so, taking on the mantle, the persona of the violator. And this is one of the deepest forms of abuse and wound, because what I carry in that arena is the wound of my parents that first of all saw the violator and identified that with me more than they saw the pleaser and the innocence and the beauty, because they related to it. They could see themselves in the violator, and so they could see me. When I finally showed up in violation, they could see me. I existed because they had a mirror inside to relate that to. So in order to exist, I had to be that and show up in that way. But simultaneously, the violator is persecuted, is demonized, is frightened and frightening. And so the core part of me is afraid. Every single time I violate a cultural taboo, an unspoken boundary, I am afraid. And what I'm afraid of in that terrain is, on the one hand, not being seen. On the other hand, and next is not being wanted. And the third is being judged as a bad and unlovable person. This is my terror every single time I violate the stated boundary to find the actual boundary. And the terror of letting, and the grief of talking about that is of not existing again. Because in my parents' world, the violator was me. And so without the violator, I didn't exist. The part that is afraid of violation, the part that desperately needs to be loved, the part that needs to be accepted, those parts do not exist in my parents' eyes. Only the violator. So the more I communicate that part of me, the more invisible I am in fear and in loneliness. The more I communicate that I am the violator and that I like violating, the more I exist, the more solid I am in my parents' eyes. And so I dissociate more from the sadness, the grief, and the terror in order to identify and pretend to enjoy the violation, tormenting my siblings, pushing my parents' boundaries. This is a terrifying experience for me. It's terrifying, it's confusing, it's lonely. I don't want to do this. But it's the only way that I exist, and it's the only way that I find something solid to regulate. I feel so much sadness around this. And it is an invisible sadness because no one sees it in the archetype or the stereotype. It's not an archetype, the stereotype of an American man. The stereotype of an American man is of a pushy, self-centered, materialistic, hedonistic, dominating, if possible, man without feelings. And that is accepted over the truth of the deep artistic desire to connect, to love, to share, to be present, to honor, to be in ritual, to explore, to feel exquisite beauty. I feel so lost and invisible in the grief of that self that the solidness of being seen and being known in the abuser is so much more safe because it exists in the minds of others, so it has contact. And when I'm consistent with that, I'm seen. And so I play into that role more and more as I dissociate from who I am and lose touch with who I am and feel the deep sadness of who I am. And it's too much to carry, the depression, the weight, the heaviness. It's too much to carry. And so I put it asleep in my body. And I pretend to be this boundary-pushing person that can't find something real without pushing through and finding boundaries. And this becomes my primary mechanism for establishing solidness and intimacy, which is important for the terrified 2-year-old who is in trauma and hasn't yet learned to push boundaries and around in an environment that doesn't have boundaries. This is important. It's really nice to see you, Dane. As I enter a new relationship, it is this confluence that I hold and must work through as a medium. Number one, terror of loneliness, terror of dissociation and abandonment. Number two, the need to violate and push in order to find something solid. Number three, the absolute terror and expectation that I will be judged, rejected, abandoned, unloved, and unwanted. And those three are my primary doorways into relating, which fill my body with a panic that cannot relax, leading to chronic fatigue. Fill me with a grief that I don't understand and is not acknowledged or recognized by anyone. The deep sadness. That leave me feeling deeply alone. And that then lead to me pushing some more, to find some contact in that aloneness, and again feeling afraid of pushing too much and pushing that energy away. And the terror of that and the despair of that dynamic and not knowing where to go. Which in turn leads to grief and panic, leads to hurt about being abandoned, and eventually to anger and hostility and rage. Anger and hostility at being hurt and abandoned, of not being seen. And there's this very, very tight thing between the pusher and the fear of being fear of being rejected for pushing, the pusher and the fear of being rejected for pushing, to find something solid. And to keep pushing and pushing often until someone leaves, looking for that solidness that is safety. All the while knowing that the part of me that pushing is somehow unlovable, because it's not me, because I don't really like it that much myself, and yet I don't know how else to find connection. I think this was exacerbated by being so overwhelmed by this dynamic that I withdrew in my teen years and did not associate with peers. It was just too volatile, too scary. But there's also a part of me that felt and knew that there's a part of me that felt and knew that I would not be understood, that I would be rejected, that I could not lean deeply on anyone because they didn't know how to hold it, and they would go away and go back to the group, but a group can't hold this energy. Only a person can. And what I wanted held was the panic. And then there was disgust with my mother for being so unconscious about all of this. There was hostility and betrayal towards my father for being malicious around this. There was a sense of superiority at knowing how to control things from this boundary pushing experience of violation, learning how to control things and to influence people. There's the higher octave of the boundary pusher, which is the joy of control, the conniving, manipulative boundary pusher that says, I can do this and it will create this, and I can do this and this will create this. And the joy and the sense of safety in that, which creates a new level of both protection, because that part protected me, but also of a sense of being unlovable, because any human being who realized my facility in that area immediately feared me. And rather than looking at the fact that I use that facility to create win-win, just, balanced, clear flows, they instead focus on what I could use that for. And in doing so, again, see the me that is the least me and blazon it into the total me and respond to me as if I am this threat. And this is, again, the wound. And there's a lot of grief. A lot of fear. And also a sense that that's the part of me that I can feel most safe with. And so as other people are projecting that fearfulness on me, there's a part of me that's taking that on and saying, yes, that's me. And there's a part of me that's just done that right now, rather than saying, no, this is a panicked coping mechanism for being completely unseen and invisible, and being desperately alone, and being used in ways that are not right for who I am, and that this part is coming in to protect me and feel some joy at the power to protect me. And yet, if I reveal that part to any human being, their fear and their response is more about how I could use that to hurt and what's somehow inhuman about my ability to see that and do that, as opposed to what's human in how I use that technology to create safety and justice for others. So there's a way that real love and caring comes out through that technology. But it isn't seen because what I could do with it is so much louder in their fears and the imbalance of power in that arena. And this is again a deep grief for not being honored as I am, rather than being honored for the threat I could be, that is presumed to be who I am. And again, there's enormous grief around this octave. And again, there's in this holding of breath between the fear and the pushing, the fear and the lever, in this holding of breath, there's almost no room to breathe. And there's no room to let someone else in their beauty. There's no room to really share my beauty. And this is the ultimate grief. This is who I am. This grief. To be continued.